Okay, so today we're going to talk about chapter 5 and 7, which is chapter 5 is elasticity and chapter 7 is on welfare. So before we get started on chapter 5, though, I kind of wanted to revisit chapter 4, and mainly just because I actually got a lot of questions on these and on this specific question in the TOPAC questions. So this is a question about a demand and supply shift. So this question kind of sets up where you are selling orange juice. The United States Food and Drug Administration releases a study that states that drinking orange juice causes cancer. So this causes orchard owners to destroy existing orange trees. So what happens to the equilibrium price and quantity? So we can see the correct answer here is price is ambiguous and quantity decreases, but what does that actually look like on a graph? So if we're looking at that on a graph, this is what it's going to look like. So it's a multi-step process. So I'm going to go through kind of the entire process. So the first part is when it's talking about the FDA releases a study that states that drinking orange juice causes cancer. That is going to cause a demand shift. So that's going to cause demand to move from this level right here down to the green line. So demand is decreasing because drinking orange juice gives you cancer. So presumably we don't want cancer. So we are going to drink less orange juice. So then that means that rather than the equilibrium being here, equilibrium is actually going to shift and it's going to shift down to here. So that's the first step. The second step is actually this part right here. So this causes orchard owners to destroy existing orange trees. So what that means then is that supply is going to shift and supply is going to decrease. So we're moving from supply here to supply here. So now we're moving from this point to this point. So notice what that says about price and quantity in comparison to the original. So this is our new right here, and this is the original. So we know that quantity is decreasing, but price is actually, it looks like it's about the same. So we really can't say anything about price. So that's why price is ambiguous, because we don't really know what happened to price. But for quantity, we can definitively say that quantity decreased. So that is kind of how you walk through an example problem with a demand and supply shift. And I'll pause here just for a second and see if anyone has any questions, since I got quite a few TOPAC questions on demand and supply shifts. Excellent. Okay, if there are no questions, then I'm going to jump right into elasticity. So this is kind of our agenda for elasticity. We're going to first talk about price elasticity of demand, move to price elasticity of supply, briefly touch on income elasticity, and cross-price elasticity. So effectively all elasticity is elasticity is just representing the change in quantity demanded or supplied, and that response to changes in its own price, the price of a related good, or income. So that's all elasticity is. We're just measuring changes in quantity demanded or supplied in response to changes in its price. So we're really looking to see what happens if price increases or decreases and what that causes quantity to do, if that causes quantity to decrease or increase. So the formula for price elasticity of demand is effectively the percentage change in quantity demanded over the percentage change in price. So pretty straightforward formula. It is not actually this easy because we use a slightly modified version of the formula. Okay, so what we're doing then is we're basically looking at the effectively, if we're just taking this formula here, we run into a problem. And that problem is it gives us, using just that formula, gives us different answers depending on where we start. So if you move from B to A or A to B, we get totally different answers. And obviously that's not what we want. We want to make sure that we have consistent answers. So because of that, we're actually going to use something called the midpoint method. And this is going to allow us to basically average. So we don't run into problems where, depending on the direction we're moving, the values are going to change. This is effectively going to minimize or eliminate that problem for us. So what we're going to do is we're going to plug this formula here into this top piece and the bottom piece. So that will be basically giving us the percentage change in quantity demanded and the percentage change in price. Okay, so now let's do a top hat question to kind of take a look at how this formula actually works. Okay, so then let's try to answer this question. So the question is asking, suppose the price of product X is reduced from $1.35 to $1.55. And as a result, the quantity demanded increases from 1,100 to 1,500. So using the midpoint method, the price elasticity of demand for X in the given price range is what? So I'll give you a couple minutes to calculate that, and then we will go over the answer. And let me know if you have any difficulty accessing or entering your response in the meantime. Yeah, let me see if I can, I'm not sure I can double share, but let me see if I can write the equation right here. And so this is for the midpoint method. So end value minus start value divided by the midpoint, which is just the end value plus the start value divided by 2. So that is the midpoint method, which then you plug into the demand equation, which is just quantity demanded divided by price. And that'll give you the elasticity. Yeah, and someone actually posted it in the chat as well. Okay, maybe I'll give another 2 minutes. And if you don't have time to answer, that's totally okay. You can just put in any answer because I'm not actually grading for correctness. I'm just grading for participation. And if you are having issues logging into Top Hat, you can also just text the response up here, and that will also make sure that your choices counted. Okay, in another minute. So if you've not yet had a chance to put in your answer, definitely do that right away. So then you'll get the participation credit, because remember, it doesn't have to be correct. The main thing is just that we're working through the problem, that you get the participation point. Yeah, and someone also mentioned that already. So basically, if you're in group B, you did not get credit for group A's questions last week, but they show up as missed. So that's not going to matter for your grade. Unfortunately, that's like a weird quirk of Top Hat. I can't actually separate the two groups, unfortunately. But yeah, no worries. That won't count to your grade. Okay, so another couple seconds. So if you have not entered your answer yet, enter your answer, and then we will walk through the process for solving this. And this is very similar to a question you could see on a midterm or final exam. Okay, so I'm going to close the question. And let's see what the results were. Okay, great. So let me share my screen and we can walk through the answer. Okay, so we have first the price. So we can see we're going to take the 135, subtract 155, then we're going to take the 135 plus the 155 divided by 2, multiply that by 100 to get the percent for price. Then we're going to do the same thing for quantity here. So we're just going to take the quantity start, quantity end, add those two together, divide them by 2 on the bottom, multiply them by 100, and we get negative 30.77. Then in the final step, we're going to just take both of these and plug them into the formula, which from here we know is quantity demanded over price. So our quantity demanded is 30.77, that goes here, and the price is going to go here. And that's going to give us 2.33, which it looks like, based on the question, about 60% of students got that. So not bad at all. Does anyone have any questions on how we worked through that problem before I move on?
I just thought that the midpoint method, I'm sorry, that it was end value minus start value. So it's start value minus end value.
Yeah, so as long as you are consistent, you can flip them, if that makes sense.
Oh, so if you were to flip both of them, you mean, like for both formulas?
Yeah, so you could flip basically, as long as you're consistent with both of these being in the same location, you could have 1.55 in this location and 1,500 in that location.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, as long as just make sure that you're consistent. That's the biggest thing.
Okay, got it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Did anyone else have any other questions on this one? Okay, so moving on. In this question, I'll actually kind of talk about a little bit more because I had some comments on this one, specifically relating to slope. So when we talk about price elasticity of demand, we don't just calculate the numbers and then ignore them. We actually calculate those numbers because those numbers can tell us something about demand. And so those numbers can tell us what the demand for a product is, and what that elasticity is, and then what that elasticity can tell us about the impact of price changes on demand. So there's kind of a general rule of thumb that price elasticity of demand is closely related to slope of the demand curve, but it is not exactly related. And that's really important. It's closely related to the slope, but not exactly. So for example, if you see a demand curve that looks something like, maybe like this. No, that's a little too extreme. Something like that. So you can generally say that this curve is going to be flatter. And so because of that, the elasticity is likely to be bigger. Whereas if the curve is steeper, so for example, something like this, the elasticity is likely to be smaller. Importantly though, those are just kind of a general sense. It's not exact. And the exactness is because the slope needs to be calculated versus the general rule of thumb. We can just kind of generally get a sense of how the curve looks and then talk about the elasticity of that. So the first type of elasticity is elastic. So that basically just means that something is really responsive to price changes. And you can tell something is elastic if the elasticity is greater than 1. So all this really means is that if the price of a good increases by 10%, the quantity decrease has to be greater than that 10%. That's all something that is elastic is telling you. Basically, the increase or decrease in price, the quantity decrease or increase has to be larger. So this number here will always be smaller than this number here if something is elastic. And we have the extreme version of elastic being perfectly elastic. So that's just this flat horizontal curve here. And all this is really saying is that price does not change. Quantity demanded can change by any percentage, but price does not change. Price is effectively always going to be constant. So that's the extreme version of elastic. The next type of elasticity that we have is inelastic. So basically, it does not respond to price changes. And we know that something is inelastic if the change is going to be less than 1. And so all we're really saying for something that's inelastic is that if the price increases by 10%, quantity decreases by less than 10%. So that's all we're saying for an elastic is basically the price increase or decrease has to be either effectively smaller than the quantity demanded decrease or increase. And we have an extreme version of that with perfectly inelastic. So effectively a completely vertical curve. In this curve basically just means that price increases or decreases and the quantity demanded does not change. A good example for like a real world type of good that is perfectly inelastic or close to being perfectly inelastic is like medicine, and specifically medicines that you need to survive. So there was a couple of years ago, the pharma bro who increased the price of essential medicine a lot. And the reason he could do that is because demand was basically perfectly inelastic. People need that to live. And so because of that, they're not going to change the quantity demanded of it if price increases a lot. So that's kind of a real world example. And generally, just kind of another example is that goods that are closer to being perfectly inelastic tend to be regulated by the government because they are goods that people need to survive. So that's just kind of a good general rule as well for things that are perfectly inelastic. And the final type of elasticity is unit elastic. So basically just a one-to-one change. And you know that it's...
I had to step away for like 2 seconds. Can you just repeat the last thing you said about government and inelastic?
Yeah. So for something that is perfectly inelastic, it's very, very likely that the government is going to have usually regulate prices because it's something that is needed by people. So usually things that are more perfectly inelastic, the government tends to regulate the prices of those more carefully than other types of goods.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. And then so for unit elastic, that basically is just a one-to-one change. So if the price increases by 10, quantity is going to decrease by 10. The inverse could also be true. So price decreases by 10, quantity increases by 10. So either of those can be true. And unit elastic is basically just usually a linear demand. So it's basically just the same change between the 2 points. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at some different examples of what determines price elasticity.
Wait, Professor.
So the first one is a substitute good. So
Professor?
Yeah,
I have a question. So when it's elastic and the quantity demanded changes and the price normally stays the same, which type of elasticity would that be?
Say that one more time. I think it kind of cut out at the end.
The quantity supplied like doesn't change as much, but the quantity supplied changes, but not the price.
Okay, so the effectively the supply is changing a lot, but the price is not changing. So something like elastic. And since you're talking specifically about supply, it would be price elasticity of supply, but it would still also be elastic.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so for the first example, I'm going to talk about substitute goods. So the example here, we have breakfast cereal and sunscreen. So the price of both goods has risen by 20%. So for which good does quantity demand drop the most and why? So when we're talking about substitutes, we think of goods that people can move to consuming if the other good changes in price. So for example, cereal has a lot of substitutes because it's just kind of like a general breakfast food. So you can switch between cereal and oatmeal, cereal and a croissant, cereal and a donut, if the price of cereal rises a lot. Whereas sunscreen doesn't really have close substitutes. If you go outside or go to the beach, you need sunscreen, and there's really not anything else you can use except not going to the beach. So because of that, consumers are not able to substitute away from sunscreen. So kind of the lesson there is that price elasticity is higher when close substitutes are available. So price elasticity is higher when you can move between consuming one good to consuming the other good. So that is the impact that substitutes have on elasticity.
Professor, would you say like luxury goods like Louis Vuitton, would you say that's pretty elastic?
Yes, yeah. So luxury goods usually tend to be very elastic, mainly just because they're not necessity goods, so people don't really need them. And because of that, if the price increases a lot, that can tend to decrease demand. Now, there's kind of like a weird separate type of goods that I'm not going to get into too much, but I'll just briefly mention it. And it's basically uh, luxury goods have like a status symbol. So some luxury goods, basically, the increase in price actually makes people want to buy more because it's like a status symbol. So that's kind of a unique type of good that we won't really talk about, but just so you're aware that it is out there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so the next example I'm going to do, I'm not going to do this one because no one asked questions on that one. And I want to make sure we were able to get through all of them. But the next one I'm going to talk about is luxury versus necessity. So let's say we're talking about insulin versus a Caribbean cruise. So the price of both goods rises by 20%. We'll ask the same question: for which good does quantity demanded drop the most and why? So insulin is a necessity. So if the price increases, that's basically going to cause very little change in demand. Whereas for a cruise is a luxury. So if the price rises for a cruise, some people are just not going to go because it's more expensive. So the general kind of lesson between a luxury and necessity good is that prices or price elasticity is higher for luxuries than for necessities. And the reason is because for necessities, people need those goods. So those goods are going to be more inelastic, and luxury goods are going to be more elastic. And then the final example is the time horizon. So basically, let's think about gasoline in the short run versus gasoline in the long run. So once again, we kind of have that same setup of a price increase of 20%. So let's look at the short run. So in the short run, there's not really much you can do to kind of avoid consuming gasoline. Because if you own a car, you commute to work, you can't really change how you commute. In the long run, however, you can buy a more fuel efficient car, you can live closer to where you work, you can even change jobs. So you can actually walk to work or something like that, or you can move to a location where you're able to ride public transit. So the lesson behind that is that price elasticity is higher in the long run than in the short run, because in the long run, you can change your behavior. In the short run, it's really hard to change your behavior, especially for something like gasoline, which most people need to get around because most people in America drive. Okay, I'm going to skip that because that's basically talking about slope, and we already touched on that. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk about was price elasticity and total revenue. So just a brief refresher for revenue. Revenue is just price times quantity. So the price of the goods a company sells times the quantity of the goods that they sell. So how does elasticity fit into that revenue stream? So we're looking at the price effect of an increase on revenue. So if you increase the price of a good you sell, that means that you get more revenue on each unit you sell. But you also sell a lower quantity, because remember, for demand, we know that the law of demand says that if price increases, quantity decreases. So what does that look like? So let's take a look at elastic demand. So let's say we have a good that moves from a price of 200 to 250, and the quantity decreases from 12 to 8. So we have this increase here in revenue due to the price increase, but we have this loss of revenue here due to lower quantity. So all that's really saying is that when demand is elastic, a price increase causes revenue to fall because the price increase is being outweighed by the quantity decrease. And we can see that here just by looking at the rectangles. This rectangle definitely smaller than the quantity rectangle. So that's kind of the impact that price elasticity has on total revenue. And then we have the opposite example for an elastic. But just really quickly, if you kind of wanted a summary, I highly recommend this table, just kind of as a good way to think about what happens to revenue when something is price elastic, price inelastic, and unit elastic. So if you want to, you are more than welcome to have this open on your midterm or final. Just kind of like a good hint there. Okay, so now let's briefly talk about price elasticity of supply. So it's actually exactly the same formula. The only thing that's changing is quantity here is quantity supplied. And so we're just basically looking here at the percentage change in quantity supplied versus the percentage change in price. And so I'm not really going to go through kind of the price elasticity of supply examples because they're basically exactly the same as price elasticity of demand, but for supply. Okay, so the next thing is income elasticity of demand. So income elasticity of demand, notice, still has the percentage change in quantity demanded here, but it switches the price for the percentage change in income. So here we're trying to understand the impact of a change in quantity demanded to a change in consumer income. And we have three different types of goods here. So we have inferior goods, where the income elasticity is less than 0. We have normal goods, where the income elasticity is greater than 0. And then finally, we have luxury goods, where income elasticity is greater than 1. So here, I kind of have an example of what happens if there is an increase in income. So let's say that everyone in the United States gets richer by $1,000 per month. What's going to happen to the quantity demanded for these three types of goods? So for inferior goods, there's going to be a fall in demand. And the reason for that is because inferior goods are goods that people don't like to consume. Oh, did someone have a question? Oh, sorry. If you did, feel free to unmute yourself or type it into the chat. So for inferior goods, we're basically talking about goods that people, once they have more money, they stop consuming. So things like cup of noodles or fast food are generally examples that we give of inferior goods. Whereas necessities, if there's an increase in income, there's a smaller rise in demand. So like you will buy a little more of it, but not a significant amount more because you need necessity goods all constantly. So you're not as likely to dramatically increase your spending on those types of goods. Whereas for luxury goods, if there's going to be a larger rise in demand. And so that could be something like a yacht, a BMW, or a Birkin bag, whereas necessities are things that we need like housing, electricity, water, and bread. Okay, and then the final type of elasticity we're going to talk about is cross-price elasticity. So basically, we're looking at the percentage change in quantity demanded for one good and the percentage change in price for a second good. So what we're trying to understand here is how responsive the quantity demanded for one good is to changes in the price of another good. So that's all we're really trying to look at here. And there are two types of goods that we try to look at for cross-price elasticity. The first are substitutes, and those are basically goods that have a cross-price elasticity of greater than 0. So an increase in the price of one good causes an increase in demand for the other good. And then you have complements, where the cross-price elasticity is less than 0. And that just means that an increase in the price of one good causes a decrease in demand for the other good. And here's kind of a little summary slide just to kind of give you an idea of what we think of for these goods. So for substitutes are things that are in competitive demand. So like Coca-Cola and Pepsi, or different fast food restaurants. And an increase in price of one good always leads to an increase in demand for the substitute, because people are moving away from the more expensive good and moving to consuming the cheaper good. Whereas complements are products that are jointly consumed. So like here I have the example of a car and gasoline, but you could also think of something like peanut butter and jelly for like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, or kind of things that are consumed together. And so for complements, an increase in the price of one good leads to the decrease in demand for the complement, because they're consumed together. Even if one good's price increases, that effectively causes the both goods to have a decrease in their quantity demanded. Okay, I see there is a question. Yeah, so I can definitely go back a slide. And then it looks like someone has their hand raised, I think. So if you want to either—
Hi.
Oh, hi, yeah.
So with inferior goods and substitute goods, I had a question in regards, could they be the same? Like, or how do you determine if an inferior good is not a substitute or vice versa?
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. So like kind of looking at income elasticity and cross price elasticity at the same time, like if a substitute could be a necessity.
Yeah, like if, like for example, like with milk, like what if it's the same product but different brand? Like if this milk is cheaper, like almond milk, let's say Silk, and then the other, I don't know, it's like this is a good question. Like for Target, for example, they have the Target brand and then they have like the other brand. So it's kind of the same item, but different, brands.
Yeah. So that's a really good question. So we will definitely talk about that quite a bit later. That's like one of the things we'll talk about like in the last part of chapter, I believe it's 15, but just to kind of like briefly touch on that for this specific chapter. Here we're assuming that all goods are the same. So like if there is Target almond milk versus like the fancier almond milk, we assume that consumers view those as exactly the same.
Gotcha.
But yeah, that's a very good question, and we will definitely get into the actual implications of that, not like the ignoring it later in the class.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Did anyone else have any other questions? Because I think for chapter 5, that wraps it up, and I'll move on to chapter 7. Okay, so let me move to chapter 7. Chapter 7 is very easy. So for chapter 7, all we're really talking about is welfare economics. The easiest thing to think about with welfare economics is just the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. So basically, we're just trying to understand the benefit that consumers get for consuming a good and the benefit that producers get for producing a good. So the producer benefit is down here, consumer benefit is up here. So basically for welfare economics, we're just kind of looking at the allocation. How are resources allocated in an economy, and who benefits from that allocation of resources? So for consumer surplus, at like a very, very simple level before we have a graph, we can think of it kind of as being the difference between what you're willing to pay for a good versus what you actually paid for a good. In this example, we can see that, so the price of a good in this case, or this good, is $260. So Shavo is willing to pay $300 for this good. So his consumer surplus is $40. because he's willing to pay 300, but he's only actually paying 260. So his benefit to consuming the good is $40. So that's all we're saying with consumer surplus. So when
Professor,
you, oh yeah,
does this have anything to do with like price ceiling and floors, or no?
yes, we will talk about price ceilings and floors. I believe that's in chapter 6, so the next chapter.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yeah. So for consumer surplus, what we look at this point is basically, we don't look at the individual consumers, we just look at the market, because the market is effectively aggregating all of the consumers who are consuming the good. And to calculate consumer surplus here, we just need the area of a triangle formula. So 1/2 base times height. So in this case, the base of this triangle is going to be 15. The height of this triangle is going to be the difference between 60 and 30, which in this case is 30. So the consumer surplus in this market is just going to be 1/2 15 times 30, or 225. So that's all we're doing for consumer surplus. Okay, and I don't think I'm going to ask this question on Top Hat, just because we're running a little short on time, but I will still go over it just to make sure everyone's following along. So this example is basically just having us calculate consumer surplus and producer surplus. So all we really need to do here is just take the quantity, which is this point right here, and the price differential. So in this case, it's going to be 4. And in this case, it's also going to be 4. So when we compute the consumer and producer surplus, this is what we're left with. So consumer surplus in this market is going to be 80, and producer surplus in this market is also going to be 80. So that leaves us with a total surplus of 160. So the total surplus in this market is $160. It's evenly split between the consumers and the producers. And in this example, the consumer surplus is the upper triangle, and actually in all examples, consumer surplus is going to be the triangle that touches the demand curve, which is this curve right here. And producer surplus is just going to be the triangle that touches the supply curve. So curve right here. So that's all we're talking about when we're talking about calculating the consumer and producer surplus of a particular good. Okay. Actually, just to make sure, I don't want to leave anyone out. So if anyone has any questions on this, I'll wait like a couple seconds. Please feel free to either type it in the chat or unmute yourself, because I definitely want to make sure everyone understands this before I move on. Looks like I'm muted. Okay, so the formula for consumer surplus is going to be this right here, which is also the same as the formula for producer surplus. So just the area of a triangle, which is just 1/2 base times height. Okay, and then, okay, so good question. So for efficiency, so what we can say here is that this is at this particular point, at this particular equilibrium, which is this equilibrium right here, this is the most efficient possible because at this price point, they are maximizing producer surplus and consumer surplus based on their supply curve and demand curve. So yeah, at this point, this is efficient. And willingness to pay. Yeah, so this is actually really interesting because we don't actually know what each individual is willing to pay for the good. We just sum it up here, and that summation is the consumer surplus. So we'll never actually know what each individual is willing to pay for the good. We just know kind of what the total market for the good is and what the total consumer surplus is. So like, for example, there might be like one person who's willing to pay $10, like this person up here. So because the price is $6, they're getting a $4 benefit out of it. So that's kind of like an example of what that could look like. Okay. So let me move to producer surplus. So producer surplus, I want to be careful the way I phrase this because last class someone got confused and I want to make sure that doesn't happen again. So the producer surplus is exactly like the consumer surplus, except when thinking about the producer surplus, think about it from the sense of the producer of the good. So the producer of the good, they are getting their surplus is effectively the price they're receiving for the good minus their cost to produce the good. The formula is still the same and everything is still the same, but I just want to make sure that you understand that the logic behind that, because the logic is definitely different. And we won't talk about the cost part now, but we will later in the class. So just make sure that you understand that producer surplus, it's still that 1/2 base times height, but the logic behind that is it is the price that the company is receiving for the good minus their costs to produce the good. So that's kind of the logic behind the equation.
Wait, could you explain the price?
Yeah, so for the price, imagine that it is a, let's say that I own a McDonald's restaurant. And so the price of a hamburger, I don't actually eat meat, so I don't know, but I'm assuming it's like $1. But let's say that, so the price of a hamburger is $1. And the cost to McDonald's for making the burger is 50 cents. Let me write that. So $1 is the amount of money that I, as McDonald's, am receiving for producing the hamburger, and the cost to me is 50 cents. So my producer surplus is going to be 50 cents. Does that kind of make sense, that like logic behind that process?
So it's like gross profit. We could like look at it that way.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, I think for now that's a safe way to think about it. Later we'll get much more detailed in like looking at profit, but for now that's definitely a safe way to look at it.
So like price would be the amount that they paid for like the ingredients, say, and then to actually make it would be like the cost.
So the price is actually the price the company is receiving for the good. So like,
okay.
it's basically like I'm paying McDonald's for the hamburger.
Oh, okay. So like the dollar is how much you pay. Okay.
Exactly.
And the cost
Yeah.
are like the ingredients.
Yeah. So the ingredients are represented by the cost.
Okay, got it. That makes a lot more sense. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Does anyone else have any questions on this? Because I want to make sure this part makes sense, because it's not super important yet, but it will be pretty important, the logic behind it, in later chapters. Okay. So finding producer surplus, as I mentioned before, is just exactly that same formula. The 1/2 base times height, which we're just finding this triangle right here in this example. And so it's basically just the quantity and the difference between the equilibrium price and the minimum price, which in this case, the price difference is going to be 25. The quantity is 25. So it's going to be 25 times 25 times 1/2, which gives us $312.50. So that's basically all we're going to do for producer surplus. Okay. So now let's talk about kind of the welfare aspect of this. So how do market economies allocate resources? So market economies allocate resources in a decentralized fashion. All that really means is that the government doesn't tell companies what to do. The companies determine for themselves based on the interactions of the buyers and the sellers. And total surplus is effectively just the consumer surplus plus producer surplus. So that's all we're looking at in this particular example for the allocation of resources. Now, a couple of people already asked this question, which is a really good question. So what does efficiency mean? So efficiency just means, and this is more thinking about it in like kind of a big a meta analysis, but it's just the value to the buyers of consuming the good minus the cost to the sellers. That's just the total surplus in the economy. And the way we talk about efficiency is we just want to know if the allocation of resources in the economy is efficient, if it just makes this as big as possible. We just want to make sure that the goods are being produced by the producers with the lowest possible costs, and the goods are being consumed by buyers who value the goods most highly. So that's all we're talking about with efficiency. Whereas equity is an entirely different question. It still has this same kind of general big meta understanding, but equity is understanding how that surplus gets distributed. And I'm sure you've all probably seen the pie chart with like how wealth is distributed in the United States, which usually it's like, 1%, like 20%, and then the bottom 10% have like this tiny little chunk right here. So like then the question is for society is that equitable? Is that an equitable distribution? And so this is where efficiency, actually, we kind of push efficiency to the side. For equity, we're concerned about whether the pie is divided fairly. And this is why in economics specifically, it's kind of a hard discussion because fairness is subjective depending on who you're talking to. Fairness is something that people have different ideas of what is fair. And so that's one of the reasons why economics tends to not focus on equity. Now, I personally think that economics should focus more on equity just because it's a significant portion of our economy and kind of how the economy operates. So there's some really interesting work being done on equity recently, but traditionally, economics is not focused on equity because it has this subjective nature. It's harder to evaluate if something's fair because depending on someone's political leanings or how they look at the world, they may judge something as being fair, whereas other people would say that's not fair. So that's kind of why equity is a little bit squishy. And equity, and this is a really important point, there is not one way to measure equity. Equity cannot be measured in a specific way. Equity is just more of a, it kind of depends on who is asking the question, if something is equitable. So there's not really going to be like a specific way to look at it. And so just kind of, I tried to kind of, because there were a lot of questions actually on Top Hat about equity. So I just kind of wanted to also just put this little blurb in that the equity questions usually boil down to people asking the question, is the government doing enough or should it do more? Is the economic distribution in society fair? And should the government redistribute wealth more than it is currently doing? So these questions can't be definitively answered in the same way that efficiency questions can be answered. But I think these questions are almost more important than efficiency because these questions are usually much more impactful into people's daily lives. In equity being specifically how fair our society is. So just kind of an important distinction between the two. Okay, so now I wanted to get into some specific questions that people had asked from Top Hat, from the Top Hat questions. Yeah, and the slides are actually already on Blackboard. So if you do want the slides, feel free to download them from Blackboard.
Professor, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
So I kind of missed the question that you asked on Top Hat. Is that going to be a problem?
If you can email me, I will give you credit for it.
Okay, thank you. What happens if you miss a question on Top Hat?
So the Top Hat questions, I just use those for giving the extra credit because basically I don't grade class attendance because I don't think it's fair, like with the pandemic, to make people like attend class at a specific time. But if you can attend class, I want to give like extra credit points. And so in the syllabus, I think it's if you attend all 6 classes that you're scheduled, you get 2% extra credit on your final grade.
Okay, thank you. Then I'll email you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and so there was only one Top Hat question today, but that's if you did not get a chance to answer that, please email me and I will make sure that you still get credit for it. Okay, so the one question that I wanted to start with was a question about the equations on the exam. So any equation that is in the lecture slides or that you've used on your Cengage MindTap homework is fair game for the exam. I will say that because like the exam is open note, that I would highly recommend that you have all of the lecture slides open. And so you can have like one screen on one side for basically the exam and the other screen is the lecture slides. That's just kind of how I would highly suggest students do it, because then you don't have to like memorize equations. Like the exam's open note, so I'm not expecting you, or I am assuming that you will use outside resources like the lecture notes and other materials provided through the class. So yeah, any equations are fair game, but the exam is open note. Okay, so someone asked a specific question, and this was from, I believe, oh yeah, does someone have a question before I move on?
Just about the exam, are you the one creating the exam, or is it like a what is it called, like department exam, like you guys all come up with the exam?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So it is a departmental exam. So basically, I think there's 7 professors teaching this course this semester. So each one of us will equally contribute questions to the exam. So I think it's like 20 something questions. So I'll probably, I'll have like 3 to 4 questions that are questions that I've written, where other professors will also have 3 to 4 questions that they've written.
But we can expect kind of MindTap questions, because I know some professors are really like, they like to make questions really complicated. And like, if you're not presented with that material, you might be confused. So I just want to make sure it's not going to be like completely like super like different than what we've been doing. Yeah,
so basically, we all use the same material. Okay. So like the kind of like on Blackboard, I do have like a couple of videos about like kind of like going over more difficult algebra problems. So I would definitely like recommend looking at those because those are fair game for the exams as well. But we do
Mm.
try pretty hard to like, we tend to teach very, very similar things because we teach from kind of a consistent course content.
Okay, got it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so let me work through this first question here. So the first question someone asked, or actually a couple of people asked this question, was I believe from chapter 7, the pre-lecture quiz in MindTap. So this question was basically asking, so it's saying Gavin has been working full-time as a gardener for $300 a week. When the market price of gardeners rises to 400, Hector becomes a gardener as well. So how much does producer surplus rise as a result of the price increase? So you can see here the correct answer is between 100 and 200. And the reason for that is because, so when Hector starts gardening, basically we know that his production costs are $300 or greater. Therefore, the maximum amount of producer surplus that Hector could be earning is $100. So basically the price that people are paying for gardening, which is 400, minus his costs, which are 300. So we know that his maximum gain is $100. So for Gavin, on the other hand, Gavin's production costs are less than 300 because he's already in the market at the previous price of $300. So the entire increase in price is going to go to producer surplus. So that means that he's going to get $100 additional producer surplus when the price rises from 300 to 400. So with all that information, we know the producer surplus increase maximum will be 100 plus 100 or 200. But likely it's going to be less than that because Hector's costs for gardening are probably going to be somewhere less or somewhere greater than 300. So because of that, we can say that the range is between 100 and 200 for the increase in producer surplus. And let me pause here and see if that makes, or if anyone has any questions. Okay, so let's move to the next question. So the next question was, I also believe from the homework for chapter 7. So this one was asking, basically there are 3 people who want to eat an ice cream cone. One person's willing to pay 12, one person is willing to pay 8, one person is willing to pay 4. The market price is $6. So consumer surplus in that example is going to equal $8 because Camilla's not going to consume because the price is greater than her willingness to pay. Whereas Alexis and Bruno are going to consume because their willingness to pay is greater than the price. So the next question then is asking if the price of an ice cream cone falls to $3, the consumer surplus of Alexis, Bruno, and Camilla increases by what? So here, we're just going to run that same process, but we're going to run it with the new price. So we see that Camilla now is going to be brought into the market because her willingness to pay of $4 is greater than the price of $3. So we can see here that this $15 is effectively going to be the new consumer surplus. So the question's asking, what is the increase in consumer surplus? So we're just going to take $15, which was the new surplus, minus the old surplus of $8 to get an increase in $7 in surplus, or option A. Okay, and if someone has a question, feel free to put it in the chat or unmute yourself, but I'm going to move to the next question. So someone just asked kind of like a generic question. What's the difference between macro and micro? So macro is just basically the entire economy, where micro, we're really looking at like individual consumers and producers in individual markets. So that's kind of the difference between macro and micro. Okay, so the next question, actually quite a few questions, we're asking about scarcity. So scarcity is really important in economics because goods and services in the economy are priced in a very specific way because of scarcity, because of how much is demanded and how much is produced. And so scarcity is also what determines when supply decreases, the price rises in the market, which you can see here on this graph. So like if there is a supply decrease, that's going to cause price to go up and quantity consumed to go down. So that is why you can think about scarcity kind of as it relates to supply. And then, like I said, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to butt in, but I'm going to skip down to the next one. So I already talked about that one. Okay. And I do know that it's getting close to time. So I do have like one more question after this, but if you have to go, that's totally fine. I totally understand. But I just want to make sure that I'm going to get through all these questions. So if you have to leave, no worries. That will not offend me. I know people have busy lives, but I will stay afterwards if I have to a little bit longer to get through the last couple of questions. Okay, so this last question is asking about, specifically talking about the pandemic. So imagine before the pandemic that there is a market for eating at a restaurant. So this is the before market. So now after the pandemic, obviously eating in a restaurant is less desirable because that is a way you can catch COVID. So the question then is that will the pandemic permanently change consumer tastes and preferences? So when we look at the prior, so this is the before example, we see demand and supply, but after, and this is really important, and this kind of gets at the demand and supply shifts. So at first, we have the pandemic decreases demand for eating at a restaurant. So that's represented here by the demand shift moving from this to the demand moving from here to here. So this is the new demand curve. But that is also now restaurants are closing because of the pandemic. So the supply curve is decreasing as well. So now we have a situation where the new equilibrium point is right here, where the price is a little bit higher than it was originally, but the quantity is significantly less. And so the question, and I think this is a really, really important one, is the pandemic going to permanently alter consumer tastes and preferences for eating at restaurants? If it does, then this demand curve could become the new normal. If it doesn't, then it's going to switch back to this. So just kind of, that was a really good question, a really interesting question. And I think that's a good way to think about demand and supply shifts. Okay, so the final question was asking about how do demand and supply work in a market with one supplier? So the first thing is we're going to discuss monopolies a lot later in class, but the person who was asking this question, or a couple of people actually kind of asked similar questions. So what if there was government? What if the government was a communist government? So basically the government produces all goods. So the question here is because the supplier has all of the power, as long as the government doesn't take advantage of any consumers, presumably the outcome would actually be the same as perfect competition. But that is contingent upon the government not taking advantage of the buyers in the market, because the government controls the price paid for the good because it's the only supplier of the good. So that effectively means that all consumers in the market would need to be treated fairly, particularly because there's only one supplier to get the good from. So just kind of something to think about as far as like monopolies. When we get into monopolies, that's a really, really important thing to remember. Okay. And with that, that